I never thought a poolside barbecue in Scottsdale could destroy someone's entire sense of belonging, but here we are. What started as a simple family gathering became the moment I realized that blood doesn't always mean family, and sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones sharpening the knife behind your back. But here's the thing about betrayal. It has a way of revealing truths that were hiding in plain sight all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun was already brutal at 11 in the morning, but my dad insisted on hosting his annual company barbecue by the pool at the Scottsdale Country Club. Collins Construction and Development had just landed the biggest government contract in company history, and Bob Collins wanted everyone to see him celebrating like the king he thought he was. I should have stayed home that Saturday, should have trusted the knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter every day since Grandpa Frank's funeral 3 months earlier. But Ashley begged me to show up, said it would look better for the family if we were all there together, presenting a united front for once. I arrived in my best attempt at looking like I belonged in this world of imported beer and catered appetizers. Fresh out of my Navy deployment, I felt like an imposter in civilian clothes, carrying a bottle of iced tea because I'd learned long ago that nobody in my family cared whether I drank their expensive alcohol or not. The pool deck was packed with employees, city contractors, and local business owners, all of them laughing too loud and shaking my father's hand like he'd personally built every bridge in Phoenix. Ashley looked perfect, as always. She wore a flowing sundress that probably cost more than most people's rent, her hair styled like she'd stepped out of a magazine, chatting effortlessly with wives of city council members about her upcoming business school graduation. I looked like exactly what I was, a veteran who'd spent the last 6 months sleeping in barracks and eating from mess halls, trying to figure out how to fit back into a world that seemed to have moved on without me. My mother Linda circulated through the crowd with practiced grace, air-kissing women she probably complained about later, and making small talk about charity events she'd never actually attend. She nodded at me when I walked in, the kind of acknowledgement you'd give a neighbor's kid, polite but distant. Nothing new there. I grabbed a plate and headed toward the food station, hoping to avoid the spotlight that always seemed to find Ashley in these situations. That's when I saw it. The presentation easel near the diving board, covered with a white cloth like it was hiding something important. My dad stood beside it, drink in hand, surveying his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who believed his own press releases. When he spotted me, he didn't smile or wave. He just nodded, the way you acknowledge someone you're obligated to tolerate but don't particularly want to engage with. The moment came after most people had eaten, when the conversations had settled into that comfortable buzz of adults who'd had just enough alcohol to feel important. Bob tapped his beer bottle with a knife, calling for attention like he was about to deliver a State of the Union address. Everyone gathered around the pool, phones coming out, cameras ready to capture whatever announcement was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that practiced authority he'd perfected over decades of construction sites and boardrooms. "Today marks a new chapter for Collins Construction and Development. We've just signed the largest contract in company history, and I want to recognize the person who made it all possible." I felt my chest tighten. For just a moment, just one fleeting second, I wondered if he might actually acknowledge the work I'd done before my deployment, the late nights I'd spent reviewing proposals and coordinating with military contractors who trusted me because I understood their world. Maybe this was his way of welcoming me back, of showing that he'd finally seen what I could contribute. He pulled away the white cloth with theatrical flair, revealing a blown-up photo of Ashley shaking hands with some government official, both of them beaming at the camera like they'd just negotiated world peace. Below the photo, in elegant script, were the words Ashley Collins, Vice President of Strategic Development, Collins Construction and Development. The crowd erupted in applause. Ashley's hand flew to her mouth in perfectly practiced surprise, her eyes bright with tears that looked genuine enough to fool everyone except someone who'd grown up watching her perform. Bob wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close like she was his greatest achievement. Ashley has shown the kind of leadership and dedication that represents the future of this company, he continued, his voice swelling with pride I'd never heard him use when talking about me. She understands what it means to put family first, to honor the legacy that my father Frank built with his own hands. I stood there holding my paper plate, watching my sister accept congratulations from people who'd probably forgotten I existed. Someone behind me whispered, "I didn't even know Bob had another daughter," and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the iced tea. Bob's speech continued, detailing Ashley's business acumen, her bright future, her natural ability to connect with clients and understand the construction industry. He talked about mentorship and legacy, about passing the torch to someone who truly understood what the Collins name meant. Every word felt deliberate, designed to highlight everything Ashley represented that I apparently didn't. When someone in the crowd asked about me, Bob's smile became more strained. "Emma's been serving our country overseas," he said, making it sound like I'd been on an extended vacation rather than working logistics for Navy operations. "She's always been more independent, more interested in forging her own path. Ashley here, she's the one who understands what family legacy really means." The dismissal was surgical in its precision. Not cruel enough to cause a scene, but clear enough that everyone understood my place in the Collins family hierarchy. I was the independent one, the one who'd chosen military service over family business, the one who didn't quite fit into their vision of success. Ashley was the future, the chosen heir, the daughter who'd stayed close to home and played by their rules. I set my plate down on a nearby table and walked toward the parking lot, my face burning with something that felt like shame but tasted like rage. Behind me, I could hear the party continuing, laughter and congratulations swirling around Ashley's promotion like she'd actually earned it through something more than birth order and strategic charm. The drive from Scottsdale back to my apartment in Tempe felt like crossing a desert of humiliation. I kept the windows down despite the heat, needing the rush of dry air to wash away the memory of those perfectly polite smiles and carefully chosen words that had just carved me out of my own family's future. The steering wheel was hot enough to burn, but I gripped it anyway, letting the physical discomfort ground me in something real while my mind tried to process what had just happened. I pulled into a Circle K near ASU, not because I needed gas, but because I needed a moment to sit in a parking lot where nobody knew me and nobody cared that I'd just been publicly erased from my family's legacy. The convenience store hummed with the sound of overworked air conditioning, and through the windows I could see college kids buying energy drinks and snacks, moving through their lives with the easy confidence of people who believed their families wanted them around. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Sorry about how that went. Dad didn't mean it the way it sounded." Even her apologies felt like performance pieces, carefully crafted to sound supportive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While taking no real responsibility, I deleted the message without responding and bought a bottle of water I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands. The apartment complex, where I'd been staying since coming back from deployment, was one of those generic places that catered to military personnel and graduate students, all beige stucco and drought-resistant landscaping. I'd chosen it because it was temporary, because I hadn't wanted to commit to anything permanent until I figured out what came next. Now it felt like a metaphor for my entire relationship with Phoenix, with my family, with the life I was supposed to want but had never quite fit into. I sat on my couch for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling fan and trying to decide if I was angrier about the dismissal itself, or about the fact that it had surprised me. Frank had always said I was too trusting, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt even when they'd already shown me who they were. Bob had been showing me who he was for years. I'd just been too stubborn to accept it. The ceiling fan reminded me of the one in Frank's old workshop, the way it would wobble slightly when the Arizona wind picked up, casting shifting shadows across his workbench. He'd died while I was deployed, and I'd come home to find that Linda had already cleaned out most of his things, donating tools and furniture to charity without asking if anyone else might want them. She'd saved a few boxes of personal items, she'd told me, things that seemed too important to throw away but not important enough to keep cluttering up the house. Those boxes were sitting in my bedroom closet, untouched since the day she'd dropped them off with the casual efficiency of someone clearing out a storage unit. I'd been avoiding them, avoiding the weight of grief that came with handling a dead man's possessions. But suddenly I wanted to be surrounded by something that had belonged to someone who'd actually given a damn about me. The first box contained mostly photographs, decades worth of construction sites and family gatherings and military reunions. Frank in his army uniform during the Korean War, looking impossibly young and serious. Frank breaking ground on his first commercial project in 1962, covered in dust and grinning like he'd just discovered gold. Frank teaching me how to read blueprints when I was 8, both of us bent over his drafting table, while he explained the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative ones. The second box was heavier, filled with old ledgers and business documents that Linda had probably assumed were worthless. Frank had been meticulous about record-keeping, the kind of man who saved receipts for pencils and documented every business conversation in careful handwriting. I flipped through pages of contract negotiations and supplier agreements, amazed by how much work had gone into building what Bob now treated like his personal kingdom. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old chamois cloth, was Frank's contractor's compass, the brass instrument he'd used for decades to ensure that every foundation was perfectly aligned. I'd always loved the weight of it, the precision of its movement, the way Frank could use it to find true north no matter where he was standing. As I lifted it out, something crinkled underneath the cloth. It was an envelope, cream-colored and heavy, with my name written across the front in Frank's distinctive block letters. Not Emma Collins or granddaughter, but simply Emma in the way he'd always addressed me, like I was the only Emma in the world who mattered. The envelope was sealed, and it felt substantial, not like a greeting card or a quick note, but like something that had required thought and planning. I opened it carefully, aware that I was probably the first person to touch these papers since Frank had placed them there. Inside were 3 folded documents and a letter written on letterhead from Collins Construction and Development, but not the current version. This was older, from back when the company logo included Frank's military service dates, and the motto, "Built on honor, measured in trust." The letter was dated 6 months before Frank died, while I was still deployed and dealing with the logistics of getting emergency leave approved for his funeral that never came in time. "Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and your father has probably already started rewriting history. I've been watching him for months now, listening to his plans for the company, for the family, for you. He thinks I don't understand what he's doing, but I built this business from nothing, and I understand men like him better than he thinks I do." My hands were shaking slightly as I continued reading. Frank's handwriting was steady and clear, each word chosen with the precision he'd brought to everything else in his life. "Your father sees you as a threat, not because you're not capable, but because you're more capable than he's comfortable with. You ask questions he can't answer, you understand the work in ways that Ashley never will, and you've got the kind of integrity that makes him nervous. He's been planning to push you out since before you enlisted, and your military service just gave him a convenient excuse to do it publicly." I stopped reading and looked up at my generic apartment ceiling, trying to process what Frank was telling me. He'd seen this coming. He'd known that Bob would use my deployment, my choice to serve, as evidence that I wasn't committed to the family business. He'd watched it happening, and he'd tried to warn me. "I've made some arrangements," the letter continued. "Legal arrangements that your father doesn't know about and can't undo. I've been working with a lawyer named David Chen, former military like us, someone who understands what service means and what it costs. He's got an office in Flagstaff, near the old mining claims I bought back in the 70s. If something happens to me, if your father tries to cut you out, David has instructions to contact you directly." The first document was a business card for David Chen, attorney at law, with an address in Flagstaff and a phone number written in Frank's handwriting. The second was a copy of a trust document, thick with legal language, that I couldn't entirely parse but that clearly listed me as the primary beneficiary of something called the Collins Legacy Trust. The third document made my breath catch in my throat. It was a property deed, dated 18 months ago, transferring ownership of the original Collins construction headquarters to the Collins Legacy Trust. Not the current gleaming office complex in Scottsdale where Bob held court, but the original building where Frank had started the company, the place where he'd built his first empire before Bob had convinced him to expand and modernize and franchise everything that had made it special. I read the deed 3 times before the implications sank in. Frank had quietly transferred the most important asset of the original company into a trust that Bob apparently knew nothing about. The building that housed the company's legal headquarters, the place where all the original contracts and government clearances were filed, belonged to me. The letter concluded with typical Frank directness. Your father thinks he can erase you from this family's story, but he's wrong about what story he's actually in charge of telling. The real Collins Construction and Development, the company I built with my own hands and my own reputation, that's not his to give away. That's yours to inherit, if you're willing to fight for it. David Chen will explain the rest. Don't let your father's small vision make you forget how big this family's legacy actually is. At the bottom, he'd signed it not with his full name but simply Frank, the way he'd signed birthday cards and Christmas presents. Informal and warm and completely certain that I'd know who it was from. I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by boxes and documents, and the sudden understanding that Frank had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. While Bob had been positioning himself as the heir apparent, while Linda had been playing the supportive wife, while Ashley had been charm schooling her way into the family business, Frank had been quietly ensuring that the foundation of everything they thought they owned actually belonged to someone else. My phone was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to make the call. David Chen's office number rang 4 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Chen and Associates, how may I help you? My name is Emma Collins, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I think you've been expecting me to call. There was a pause, then a warmer tone. Emma. Yes, I've been waiting for this call for 3 months. Frank said you'd contact me when you were ready to learn the truth about your inheritance. Are you ready? I looked around my temporary apartment, at the boxes of Frank's belongings, at the deed that proved my family had been lying to me about more than just their feelings. I'm ready, I said. Good, David Chen replied, because what your grandfather built for you is a lot bigger than what your father tried to take away. Can you drive up to Flagstaff tomorrow? There are some things you need to see in person. The drive from Tempe to Flagstaff took 2 hours through desert landscape that gradually gave way to pine forests and red rock formations. I'd made this drive dozens of times as a kid when Frank would take me to see the old mining claims he'd bought as investments, but today the familiar route felt like a journey into completely unknown territory. My truck's air conditioning struggled against the climbing elevation and my own nervous energy as I tried to imagine what David Chen might tell me that could be bigger than discovering I owned the original company headquarters. Flagstaff had the clean, thin air of high altitude and the kind of mountain town charm that attracted tourists and college students in equal measure. David Chen's office was located in a converted Victorian house near Northern Arizona University, the kind of place where lawyers who actually cared about their clients chose to practice rather than competing for the biggest glass tower downtown. The brass nameplate by the door read Chen and Associates Veterans Legal Services, in simple block letters that reminded me of Frank's no-nonsense approach to everything. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s who looked like she could organize a military operation and make it run on time. She smiled when I gave my name, the kind of genuine recognition that told me Frank had talked about me enough that she felt like she knew me. Emma Collins, she said, standing to shake my hand. David's been looking forward to meeting you. He has a lot of respect for your grandfather. David Chen himself was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of precise bearing that marked him as former military even in civilian clothes. His office was lined with law books and military memorabilia, and his desk was organized with the efficiency of someone who understood that details mattered when lives and livelihoods were on the line. He stood when I entered, offering a firm handshake and the direct eye contact of someone who had nothing to hide. Frank talked about you constantly, he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. He was proud of your Navy service, proud of your work ethic, and worried about what your father was planning to do once he was gone. He came to me about 18 months ago with a very specific set of concerns and a very specific plan to address them. I settled into the chair, noting the way David spoke about Frank in present tense, as if his influence were still actively shaping events. He said in his letter that he'd made legal arrangements, something my father doesn't know about. The deed I found transfers the original headquarters building to something called the Collins Legacy Trust. David smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting months to have this exact conversation. "That's just the beginning," he said, opening a thick file folder that bore my name in Frank's handwriting. "Your grandfather was a lot more strategic than your father ever gave him credit for. Bob thinks he inherited a construction company. What he actually inherited was the right to use the Collins name and work out of the newer facilities. Frank made sure the real foundation of the business stayed in the family he could trust. He pulled out a bound document that looked like a small book, official seals and ribbons, marking it as something that had been filed with multiple government agencies. This is the complete Collins Legacy Trust, established and funded over the past 2 years while you were deployed." Frank was very careful about the timing, making sure everything was finalized before your father could realize what was happening. I opened the document, scanning pages of legal language that gradually began to make sense as David explained what I was looking at. The trust didn't just include the original headquarters building. It included the mineral rights to 6 different properties throughout northern Arizona, the original government contracts that had established Collins Construction as a certified veteran-owned business, and what the document called foundational intellectual property, related to specialized construction techniques Frank had developed over decades in the industry. "Your grandfather was smarter than anyone realized," David continued, spreading additional documents across his desk like he was laying out evidence in a court case. "He understood that Bob was planning to sell the company to a corporate buyer, probably within the next year or 2. Frank had been hearing rumors through his contacts in the construction industry, people who'd been approached about potential acquisitions, suppliers who'd been asked about their relationships with Collins Construction. The implications of what David was telling me began to sink in as I read through contract after contract that bore Frank's signature and mine as the designated successor. "Bob doesn't know about any of this. Your father knows that Frank set up some kind of trust for you, but he assumes it's a modest inheritance, maybe the cabin property and some personal effects. He has no idea that Frank essentially split the company in half, keeping the valuable foundations and giving Bob the right to manage the day-to-day operations. It's actually quite elegant from a legal standpoint." David pulled out a map of Arizona marked with red circles and boundary lines that meant nothing to me until he began explaining what they represented. 3 of the properties were located along proposed routes for new interstate highway expansions, land that Frank had purchased quietly over the past decade, as government documents had revealed long-term infrastructure plans. 2 others sat on mineral deposits that recent geological surveys had identified as potentially valuable for rare earth metals used in electronics manufacturing. Frank spent 40 years building relationships with people in the military, in government, in construction, David said, pointing to different sections of the map. He knew how to read plans that were still classified, how to interpret budget allocations that wouldn't be public for years. While your father was focused on the quarterly profits and the social status of running a successful business, Frank was building generational wealth. The 6th property was the one that made my hands shake as I read the description. It was 120 acres of desert land outside Sedona, seemingly worthless scrubland that Frank had purchased for almost nothing in the 1980s. According to the geological survey attached to the trust documents, recent exploratory drilling had revealed underground water sources that could make the land extremely valuable for development in a state where water rights were becoming more precious than gold. "He knew," I said, staring at the survey reports and water rights documentation. Frank knew that Arizona was going to keep growing, that water was going to become the limiting factor for all development in the Southwest. David nodded approvingly, like a teacher whose student had just grasped a particularly complex concept. "Your grandfather understood that real wealth isn't built in the short term, by chasing the biggest contracts or the flashiest projects. Real wealth is built by understanding what will be valuable 20 or 30 years from now and positioning yourself to own it when everyone else realizes what it's worth." He handed me another document, this one bearing recent dates and signatures I didn't recognize. "This is where it gets interesting for your current situation. Last month, Bob was approached by Desert Development Corporation, a subsidiary of a major national construction company, about purchasing Collins Construction and Development. The offer was substantial enough that Bob has already started preliminary negotiations. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I read the purchase agreement draft that David showed me. Bob was planning to sell everything, the company name, the contracts, the facilities, all of it, for a sum that would make him wealthy enough to retire in comfort, while leaving Ashley positioned to work for the corporate buyer if she chose to stay in the construction industry. The problem, David continued, is that Bob can't actually sell what he doesn't own. The original government contracts that established Collins Construction as a certified veteran-owned business are tied to the headquarters building that's now part of your trust. The specialized construction techniques that make the company valuable for government work are documented in patents and trade secrets that Frank registered under the trust's ownership. Bob can sell his management company, but he can't sell the Collins Construction that actually has the relationships and certifications that make it worth buying. The scope of Frank's planning was becoming clear, and it was both impressive and slightly terrifying. He'd essentially built a legal maze that would prevent Bob from destroying what he'd spent 40 years creating, while ensuring that I inherited not just a company but a foundation for long-term financial security that extended far beyond the construction industry. "There's more," David said, pulling out a manila envelope that had been sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal. "Frank recorded several video messages for you, explanations of his thinking and instructions for how to proceed once you understood the full scope of what he'd set up. He wanted you to hear directly from him why he made these choices and what he hoped you'd do with what he was leaving you." I held the envelope without opening it, trying to process the magnitude of what Frank had accomplished while I was deployed, and Bob was planning to erase me from the family business. What happens now? What am I supposed to do with all of this? David leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity I'd seen in commanding officers who were trying to determine if someone was ready for increased responsibility. "That depends on what you want to happen. Frank's arrangements give you several options. You could remain silent, let Bob complete his sale to Desert Development Corporation, and then reveal that the buyer didn't actually acquire the assets they thought they were purchasing. The resulting legal complications would probably void the sale and leave Bob in a very difficult position." He paused, letting the implications of that option settle before continuing. "Or you could use your ownership of the foundational assets to force Bob into a partnership he doesn't want, making yourself an equal player in any future business decisions. Frank's documentation gives you the legal standing to demand a seat at the table for any major transactions." The third option was the one that made my pulse quicken with possibility. "Or you could activate the trust's emergency provisions, take full control of the original Collins Construction, and rebuild the company according to your own vision." Frank included detailed instructions for how to exercise this option, including a network of contacts who've been waiting to work with you once you were ready to step into leadership. I opened the sealed envelope carefully, finding a single sheet of paper with Frank's handwriting and a small key, attached with a piece of string. The note was brief. "Emma, the choice is yours, but remember that some things are worth fighting for, not because they're easy, but because they're right. The key opens a storage unit in Sedona, where I've kept everything you'll need to understand what you're inheriting and what it can become. Trust your instincts, trust your training, and trust that you're exactly the person I hoped you'd become." The address of the storage unit was written below his signature, along with a combination that I recognized as his old Army service number. Even in death, Frank was still teaching me lessons about planning, preparation, and the importance of understanding exactly what resources you had available before making strategic decisions. David handed me copies of all the trust documents, organized in folders that would allow me to study the details at my own pace. "Take your time with this," he advised. Frank knew that you'd need time to understand the full scope of what he built and what your options are. But don't take too long. Bob's negotiations with Desert Development Corporation are moving forward quickly, and once he signs a preliminary agreement, your window for action will become much smaller. I left David Chen's office with a cardboard box full of legal documents, a key to a storage unit, and the growing understanding that Frank had been fighting a war one hadn't even known was happening. The drive back towards Sedona took me through red rock country that looked like the landscape of another planet, vast and ancient, and completely indifferent to human ambitions. But for the first time since Frank's funeral, I felt like I understood what my place in the family actually was. Frank hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left me the tools to reclaim everything Bob thought he could take away. The storage facility in Sedona sat at the edge of town, where red rock formations met practical strip mall architecture, the kind of place where people kept their overflow possessions and forgotten inheritances. Unit 247 was in the back row, away from the main traffic flow, and the key Frank had left me turned easily in the lock, despite months of Arizona weather and neglect. When I lifted the metal door, the smell hit me first: dust and old paper, and something faintly mechanical that reminded me of Frank's workshop. The unit was organized with military precision, everything labeled and categorized in a way that made it clear Frank had spent considerable time preparing this archive for someone who would need to understand it quickly. Metal shelving lined both walls, filled with bankers' boxes that bore dates and subject headings in his careful handwriting. Government contracts 1975 to 1990. Mineral rights documentation. Personnel files confidential. Corporate espionage evidence. That last label made me pause, wondering what Frank had discovered about corporate espionage that required its own dedicated storage box. A small desk sat in the corner, positioned under a battery-powered lantern that Frank had left ready for use. On the desk's surface was a manila folder marked "Start Here," and a tablet computer still showing half battery life, despite months of storage. Frank had always been surprisingly comfortable with technology for someone his age, and apparently he'd used that comfort to create a digital archive that complemented the physical documents surrounding me. I opened the Start Here folder first, finding a letter dated just 2 weeks before Frank's death, written on his personal letterhead with the kind of formal tone he used when he was documenting something for legal purposes. "Emma," the letter began, "if you're reading this in the storage unit, then David Chen has done his job and you're beginning to understand what I've been building for you. What you found in his office represents the legal framework, but what you'll find here represents the intelligence that made that framework necessary. Your father has been planning your exclusion from this family's business for longer than you realize, and his motivations go deeper than simple favoritism toward Ashley." The letter continued with a level of detail that made it clear Frank had been conducting his own investigation into Bob's activities for at least 2 years before his death. He'd been tracking phone calls, documenting meetings, even recording conversations when Bob thought he was speaking privately. The tablet contained audio files, spreadsheets, and what appeared to be a comprehensive timeline of Bob's secret negotiations with potential buyers. I powered on the tablet, navigating through folders that revealed the scope of Frank's detective work. The audio files were particularly damning, recordings of Bob speaking with representatives from Desert Development Corporation about the best strategies for removing what he called legacy complications from the business before a sale could be completed. In one conversation dated 8 months ago, Bob explicitly discussed the benefits of Emma's military deployment, describing it as an opportunity to, quote, restructure family involvement while she's out of the picture. "The problem with Emma," Bob's voice said through the tablet's small speakers, "is that she actually understands the construction business. She asks the right questions, she knows what the contracts mean, and the military guys trust her in ways they'll never trust Ashley. If we're going to position this as a clean family succession, we need Emma either fully committed to Ashley's leadership or completely out of the equation." The corporate representative's response was equally revealing. "Family dynamics can complicate acquisitions. Our preference is always for clear ownership structures, without competing claims or potential future disputes. If there's any possibility that Emma might challenge Ashley's authority after a sale, that could affect our valuation significantly." I listened to conversation after conversation where Bob systematically planned to marginalize my role in the family business, while positioning Ashley as the sole heir to everything Frank had built. The recordings revealed that Bob had been telling potential buyers that I was unreliable and uncommitted to civilian business, using my military service as evidence that I wasn't serious about joining the family company. The physical documents told an even more comprehensive story. Frank had been saving every email, every contract draft, every financial statement that revealed Bob's true intentions for the company. One box contained correspondence between Bob and various corporate buyers dating back 3 years, long before Frank's health had started declining. Bob hadn't been responding to acquisition offers. He'd been actively soliciting them, shopping the company around while Frank was still alive and officially in charge. Another box revealed something that made my hands shake with anger. Frank had documented a systematic campaign by Bob to exclude me from family business conversations, including evidence that Bob had been intercepting calls and emails intended for Frank during the months when I was deployed. Phone records showed multiple instances where calls from my deployment base had been routed to Bob's office instead of Frank's, with notes indicating that Bob had told callers Frank was unavailable or not handling business matters anymore, even when Frank was perfectly capable of taking calls. Most damaging were the financial documents that showed Bob had been moving money out of company accounts and into personal investments, apparently preparing for a future where he would own a percentage of a larger corporate entity, rather than managing the independent family business Frank had built. The paper trail revealed that Bob had already moved nearly $2 million from company reserves into offshore accounts, funds that wouldn't be part of any corporate acquisition, and would essentially disappear if Frank's trust arrangements hadn't preserved the legal right to audit all company finances. The video files on the tablet were perhaps the most emotionally difficult to watch. Frank had recorded dozens of messages over his final months, some clearly intended for me and others that appeared to be his way of processing what he was discovering about Bob's plans. In one video dated just a month before his death, Frank sat at this same desk, looking tired but determined. "I keep thinking I should confront Bob directly," he said to the camera. "Tell him I know what he's planning and give him a chance to change course. But every conversation I've tried to have with him about Emma's future role in the company gets deflected or dismissed. He's made up his mind about what this family should look like, and it doesn't include recognizing Emma's capabilities or honoring her commitment to something larger than herself." Frank paused in the video, looking directly into the camera with the intensity I remembered from childhood when he was teaching me something he considered critically important. "I built this company with my own hands and my own reputation," he continued. "I earned every government contract by proving that Collins Construction could be trusted with projects that mattered, that affected people's safety and security. Bob sees that reputation as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Emma sees it as a responsibility to be upheld. That's why she's the one who deserves to inherit what I actually built, not just what it can be sold for." Another video showed Frank explaining his strategy for protecting the company's foundational assets, while allowing Bob to believe he was inheriting operational control. "The beauty of this arrangement," Frank said with the slight smile I remembered from when he was particularly proud of solving a complex problem, "is that Bob will discover he can't actually sell what he doesn't own. The corporate buyers want Collins Construction's government relationships and specialized certifications, but those belong to the trust now. Bob can sell them the right to use his management company, but he can't transfer the assets that make Collins Construction valuable in the first place." The final box I opened contained personal items that Frank had saved from throughout my life. Report cards from elementary school where teachers had noted my exceptional problem-solving abilities, letters I'd written him during basic training, describing the leadership challenges I was learning to navigate, photographs of us working together on construction projects where he'd been teaching me to read blueprints and understand load calculations. At the bottom of this box was a leather-bound journal that Frank had been keeping during his final months, documenting not just Bob's business machinations, but his own thoughts about family, legacy, and what it meant to leave something worthwhile behind. "Emma reminds me of myself at her age," one entry read. "She's not interested in taking shortcuts or trading on the family name. She wants to understand how things actually work, wants to build something that will last." Bob has spent so many years focused on appearance and profit margins that he's forgotten what made this company worth building in the first place. Another entry, dated just days before Frank's death, revealed the full scope of his concern about my future. "I'm running out of time to protect Emma from what Bob is planning. The sale negotiations are moving faster than I expected, and once Bob signs a preliminary agreement, my options for preserving the company's integrity become much more limited. Everything depends on Emma finding these documents after I'm gone, and understanding that she has the legal tools to fight for what's rightfully hers. The last item in the personal box was a sealed envelope marked, "If everything else fails," in Frank's handwriting. Inside was a single key and an address in Phoenix I didn't recognize, along with a note that read, "Emergency fund," enough to start over completely if Bob destroys everything else. Sometimes, the only way to honor the past is to build a better future. I sat in the storage unit surrounded by evidence of Bob's betrayal and Frank's counterplanning, trying to process the magnitude of what had been happening while I was deployed and focused on military responsibilities. Frank had, essentially, been fighting a covert war to preserve his life's work while managing his own declining health and keeping his suspicions secret from the rest of the family. The tablet contained one final video message, recorded just 3 days before Frank's death, when he was clearly struggling with fatigue but determined to leave me with clear instructions. "Emma," he said, his voice weaker than in the earlier recordings, but his eyes still sharp with purpose. "By the time you see this, you'll know that your family situation is more complicated than you thought. Bob isn't just favoring Ashley out of parental bias. He's actively working to ensure that you never have the opportunity to claim your place in this family's legacy. The documents I've left you prove that he's been planning your exclusion for years, probably since before you enlisted." Frank leaned closer to the camera, and I could see the determination that had driven him to build a construction empire from nothing. "You have 2 choices. You can use this information to fight for your place in Bob's version of the family business, demanding recognition and inclusion in his plans to sell everything I built. Or you can use these resources to build something better, something that honors what Collins Construction was supposed to represent, before Bob decided it was more valuable as a commodity than as a calling." He pointed toward something off-camera, probably indicating the boxes of documents and evidence surrounding him. "Everything you need is here. Legal documentation, financial resources, business relationships, and most importantly, the truth about who you are and what you're capable of accomplishing. Don't let Bob's small vision convince you that your worth is determined by his approval. You're a Collins. Act like it." The video ended with Frank looking directly into the camera for several seconds of silence, and I felt like he was looking at me across the months since his death, reminding me that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. I began loading boxes into my truck, systematic and thorough in the way Frank had taught me to approach any complex project. The storage unit had contained more than evidence of Bob's betrayal. It contained the tools for my liberation from a family dynamic that had never served me and never intended to. As I locked the empty storage unit and drove back toward Phoenix, I knew that the barbecue where Bob had publicly dismissed me had been the beginning of something much larger than family drama. It had been the opening move in a war that Frank had been preparing me to win. The evidence Frank had left me painted a picture so comprehensive and damaging that I spent 3 days just organizing it into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Bob had been systematically undermining me for years, but more than that, he'd been preparing to sell Frank's life work to the highest bidder, while lying to everyone about his motivations and timeline. The recordings, documents, and financial trails formed an airtight case that Bob had been operating in bad faith since long before Frank's death. I called David Chen and arranged a meeting at his Flagstaff office, bringing copies of everything I'd found in the storage unit. His reaction to the audio recordings was immediate and professional. He'd clearly dealt with family business fraud before, but the scope of Bob's deception seemed to surprise even him. "This changes everything," David said, reviewing the financial documents that showed Bob moving company money into personal accounts. What Frank suspected about the sale negotiations was actually understated. "Your father isn't just planning to sell Collins Construction. He's been systematically looting it while positioning himself to profit from the sale without sharing any proceeds with the legitimate heirs." We spent hours going through the timeline, connecting Bob's secret meetings with corporate buyers to his public statements about the company's future and Ashley's role in it. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Bob had been telling potential buyers that he had complete control over Collins Construction's assets while simultaneously telling Frank and the family that no serious sale discussions were taking place. The problem for Bob, David explained, is that Frank's trust arrangements mean he can't actually deliver what he's been promising these corporate buyers. The original headquarters building, the government contracts, the specialized certifications, all of that belongs to you now. Bob can sell his management operation, but he can't transfer the foundational assets that make Collins Construction worth acquiring. The legal implications were staggering. Bob had essentially been negotiating the sale of assets he didn't own, while using his position as company president to move legitimate company funds into accounts that wouldn't be part of any acquisition. If the corporate buyers discovered that they weren't actually purchasing what they thought they were buying, the resulting legal complications could destroy Bob financially and professionally. "What are my options?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that Frank had positioned me to have considerably more leverage than Bob realized. David spread the trust documents across his desk, pointing to specific clauses that Frank had included for exactly this scenario. Frank anticipated that Bob might try to sell the company before you could establish your rightful position. The trust includes what we call nuclear options, legal mechanisms that would allow you to take immediate control of the foundational assets if Bob attempts to transfer ownership without your consent. The first option was immediate and devastating. I could file an injunction that would freeze all company assets pending resolution of the ownership dispute. This would stop Bob's sale negotiations completely, while forcing him to prove in court that he had the right to sell what he was selling. Given the evidence of financial misconduct and asset concealment, this legal challenge would almost certainly succeed, and would probably result in criminal charges against Bob for fraud. The second option was more strategic but potentially more satisfying. I could wait until Bob had signed a preliminary agreement with Desert Development Corporation, then reveal that the sale was invalid because he'd misrepresented his ownership of key assets. This would leave Bob facing breach of contract lawsuits from angry corporate buyers, while simultaneously losing control of the company he'd been trying to sell. The third option was the one that appealed to me most. I could use my ownership of the foundational assets to force a complete restructuring of Collins Construction, removing Bob from leadership and taking direct control of the company he'd been planning to destroy. "Frank designed these options to give you maximum flexibility," David said, but he also included a recommendation for how he hoped you'd proceed. He wanted you to save the company if possible, but more importantly, he wanted you to build something better than what Bob was planning to tear down. I spent the drive back to Phoenix thinking about Frank's final video message, his reminder that I was a Collins and should act like it. Bob had been acting like a Collins too, but his version of the family legacy was based on extracting maximum value for minimum effort. Frank's version was based on building something that would last, something that would honor the reputation he'd spent 40 years establishing. That evening, I called Ashley. We hadn't spoken since the barbecue, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice when she answered the phone. "Emma? I've been wondering when you'd call. Dad said you were probably upset about the promotion announcement, but I thought maybe you'd want to talk about it." "I do want to talk," I said, "but not about the promotion. About what Dad's been planning for the company, and what you actually know about it." There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" "Ashley, has Dad told you anything about selling Collins Construction, about negotiations with corporate buyers?" Another pause, longer this time. He mentioned that someone had approached him about a potential partnership, but he said it was just exploratory, nothing serious. I felt something settle in my chest, a certainty that Ashley had been as manipulated as I had, just in a different direction. "Ashley, I need you to meet me somewhere we can talk privately. There are things about Dad's plans that you need to know, things that affect both of us." We met at a coffee shop in Tempe, neutral territory where neither of us would feel like we were on the other's turf. Ashley arrived looking nervous, still wearing the carefully polished appearance she maintained for family business functions, but her usual confidence seemed shaken. I showed her selected portions of Frank's documentation, focusing on the evidence that Bob had been negotiating a complete sale of the company while telling her she was being positioned for long-term leadership. Her face went pale as she read through financial records showing that Bob had already received substantial payments from Desert Development Corporation as, quote, consultation fees, for what the contracts described as quote, pre-acquisition due diligence. He's been lying to me, Ashley said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me the promotion meant I was being prepared to take over when he retired, that Collins Construction would stay in the family. But these documents show he's been planning to sell everything. I watched her process the betrayal, seeing her understand that Bob's version of family legacy was as hollow for her as it had been for me. Ashley, there's more. Frank left me legal ownership of the original company assets. The headquarters building, the government contracts, the certifications that make Collins Construction valuable. Bob can't actually sell those because they belong to me now. She looked up from the documents, her expression shifting from hurt to something that looked like relief. So the sale can't happen? Not the way Bob has been planning it. But that's not the only issue. These financial records show that Bob has been moving company money into personal accounts, probably to hide assets from any potential acquisition. If that's true, he's been stealing from the company while negotiating to sell it. Ashley sat back in her chair, staring at the evidence spread across the table between us. What are you going to do? I'm going to stop him, I said. The question is whether you want to help me save the company, or whether you want to keep pretending that Dad's version of the family legacy is worth preserving. She was quiet for several minutes, reading through more of Frank's documentation, and gradually understanding the scope of Bob's deception. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since we were children, direct, honest, and slightly scared. I don't want to work for some corporate buyer who doesn't understand what Collins Construction is supposed to represent, she said. And I don't want to be part of Dad's plan if it means destroying what Grandpa built. But I don't know anything about running a construction company. The promotion was mostly ceremonial. Dad never actually taught me how the business works. Then we'll learn together, I said. Frank left detailed documentation about the company's operations, and I've got military experience with logistics and project management. Between us, we can figure out how to run Collins Construction the way it was supposed to be run. The next step was confronting Bob directly, but I wanted to do it in a way that would prevent him from destroying evidence or manipulating the situation. David Chen suggested that we arrange a formal meeting at his office, positioning it as a routine discussion of Frank's estate, but actually serving as a legal confrontation, where Bob would be forced to respond to the evidence of his misconduct. Bob arrived at David Chen's office the following week wearing his best suit and the confident smile of someone who believed he was managing a minor complication in his larger plans. He brought his own lawyer, a corporate attorney from Phoenix who specialized in business acquisitions and clearly expected to be dealing with a simple inheritance dispute. I understand Emma has some questions about Frank's estate arrangements, Bob said, settling into his chair with the casual authority he'd always used when he wanted to control a conversation. I'm happy to clear up any confusion about the family business structure. David Chen spread the trust documents across his conference table with the methodical precision of someone presenting evidence in court. Mr. Collins, I think you'll find that Emma's inheritance is more substantial than you realized. Frank transferred ownership of several key business assets to the Collins Legacy Trust over the past 2 years, including the original headquarters building and the foundational contracts that establish Collins Construction as a certified veteran-owned business. Bob's confident expression began to falter as he read through the legal documents. His lawyer leaned in, reviewing the trust paperwork, and clearly recognizing the implications for any potential sale negotiations. This is impossible, Bob said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Frank never mentioned transferring any business assets. These documents must be invalid. David Chen smiled with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this objection. The transfers were properly executed and filed with all relevant agencies. But that's not the most concerning issue we need to discuss today. He activated a tablet computer and played one of the audio recordings where Bob explicitly discussed strategies for excluding me from the family business, while positioning Ashley as the sole heir to a company he was planning to sell. Bob's own voice filled the conference room, describing me as unreliable and uncommitted to civilian business, while he negotiated with corporate buyers about the best timeline for completing an acquisition. The color drained from Bob's face as he listened to his own words being played back in a legal setting. His lawyer was taking notes rapidly, clearly recognizing that his client had been caught in a serious legal violation. Frank recorded dozens of these conversations, David continued, advancing to financial documents that showed Bob moving company funds into personal accounts. We also have comprehensive documentation of the financial misconduct that accompanied your sale negotiations. You've been stealing from Collins Construction while simultaneously misrepresenting your ownership of the assets you were negotiating to sell. Bob's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Bob ignored the advice and leaned forward aggressively. Frank was senile during his final months. These recordings don't prove anything, except that he was confused about business operations. David Chen smiled again, and I realized he'd been hoping Bob would make exactly that claim. We anticipated you might question Frank's mental competency. That's why we have psychiatric evaluations from 2 independent specialists, conducted just months before his death, confirming that he was mentally sharp and fully capable of making complex business decisions. The meeting continued for another hour, with David methodically presenting evidence that destroyed every aspect of Bob's defense. The financial records showed systematic theft, the audio recordings proved deliberate fraud, and the psychiatric evaluations confirmed that Frank had been competent when he'd made his arrangements to protect the company from Bob's plans. By the end of the meeting, Bob's lawyer was advising him to consider a settlement that would avoid criminal prosecution for fraud and embezzlement. Bob himself looked like a man who'd just realized that his carefully planned future had collapsed completely. "What do you want?" Bob asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "I want you to resign from Collins Construction immediately," I said. "I want you to return every dollar you've moved from company accounts into personal investments. And I want you to publicly acknowledge that your sale negotiations with Desert Development Corporation were conducted without proper authority." Bob stared at me across the conference table, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look at me like I was someone who mattered, someone whose decisions could affect his future. "And if I refuse?" David Chen answered before I could. "Then we file criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. We seek an injunction that freezes all your personal assets pending resolution of the theft charges, and we make sure that every potential corporate buyer in the construction industry knows that you attempted to sell assets you didn't own while stealing from the company you were supposed to be managing." Bob signed the resignation papers that afternoon. The transition period was complicated but ultimately successful. Ashley proved to be more capable than either of us had expected, particularly with client relationships and project coordination. I focused on the operational aspects that my military experience had prepared me for: logistics, personnel management, and the complex coordination required to complete government contracts on time and budget. Within 6 months, we'd restructured Collins Construction according to Frank's original vision, a veteran-owned business that specialized in projects that mattered, that affected community safety and infrastructure development. We hired several veterans as project managers, established partnerships with local trade schools to provide apprenticeship opportunities, and began focusing on contracts that emphasized long-term community impact rather than short-term profit maximization. Bob disappeared from Phoenix shortly after his resignation, apparently relocating to Florida where Linda had family. He made no attempt to maintain relationships with Ashley or me, which suited both of us perfectly. Linda tried to arrange reconciliation dinners for several months, but eventually gave up when it became clear that neither Ashley nor I had any interest in pretending that family relationships could be rebuilt on the foundation of lies and manipulation that Bob had established. The company thrived under our joint leadership. Ashley's business education proved valuable for client development and financial management, while my military background helped with the operational complexity of large-scale construction projects. We developed a reputation for completing difficult projects ahead of schedule and under budget, particularly those involving veteran facilities and community infrastructure. 2 years after Bob's resignation, we established the Frank Collins Memorial Foundation, using profits from the company's success to provide construction training and job placement services for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The foundation operated out of a renovated building on the original Collins Construction property, and we made sure that every veteran who participated in the program understood that they were part of a legacy that honored service and commitment, rather than treating them as stepping stones to personal wealth. Ashley and I never became close the way some siblings are, but we developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to honoring Frank's vision for what the family business could represent. She handled the aspects of company leadership that required charm and relationship building, while I focused on the technical and operational challenges that required military-style discipline and attention to detail. The day we dedicated the Frank Collins Memorial Foundation, Ashley stood beside me at the podium, both of us wearing Collins construction polo shirts and work boots instead of the business formal attire that Bob had always insisted was necessary for public appearances. Frank Collins built this company with his own hands and his own reputation, Ashley said to the crowd of veterans, community leaders, and construction industry professionals who'd gathered for the dedication ceremony. He believed that success meant building something that would outlast you, something that would make the community stronger long after you were gone. Emma and I are committed to making sure that Collins Construction continues to operate according to those principles. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at faces that included several veterans I'd served with, local officials who'd worked with Frank for decades, and young people who were just beginning their careers in construction and didn't yet understand how rare it was to work for a company that prioritized mission over profit. Frank once told me that the measure of a family business isn't how much money it can generate for the family, but how much good it can do for the community, I said. Today we're not just dedicating a foundation. We're dedicating ourselves to the principle that some things are worth building, not because they're profitable, but because they're right. The applause felt different from the polite recognition I'd received at corporate events during Bob's tenure. This felt like acknowledgement from people who understood what Frank had actually been trying to build, and what Ashley and I were committed to preserving. After the ceremony, I walked through the renovated building, where veterans were learning solar panel installation, concrete finishing, and project management skills that would allow them to build civilian careers that honored their military training. The classroom walls were lined with photographs from Frank's construction projects over the decades, images that showed the bridges, schools, and community centers that bore his signature, even if they didn't bear his name. That evening, I drove up to Sedona and hiked to the overlook where Frank used to take me when I was a child, and wanted to understand how surveying and land development actually worked. The red rocks looked the same as they had 20 years ago, ancient and permanent in a way that made human ambitions seem both insignificant and crucially important. I thought about the barbecue where Bob had publicly dismissed me as someone who didn't understand what family legacy really meant. He'd been right about one thing. I hadn't understood family legacy the way he defined it, but Frank had taught me a different definition, one based on building something that would serve people and communities long after the builders were forgotten. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. New contract approved, Veterans Administration Medical Center in Tucson. 18-month timeline. Frank would be proud. I smiled, looking out at the landscape Frank had taught me to read like a blueprint, understanding finally that some inheritances can't be stolen because they live in what you know how to build rather than what you own. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and possibility across the red rocks that had been Frank's favorite place to think about the future. I'd inherited more than money, or property, or business assets. I'd inherited the knowledge that work done right becomes its own legacy, that honor isn't something you claim but something you earn through what you choose to build. Collins Construction would continue to grow, the foundation would train hundreds of veterans, and Ashley and I would spend the rest of our careers proving that Frank's vision for family business was worth preserving. But more than that, I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming the person they never believed you could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.